All right, well, we might start and welcome everyone to the final, last but definitely not least, stakeholder forum for the Energy Charter Independent Accountability Panel. I'd like to start the meeting by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Let me introduce the panel. I'm Claire Petrie. I was the former Energy and Water Ombudsman in New South Wales. Cassandra Goldie is CEO of ACOS, and Andrew Richards is CEO of the Energy Users Association of Australia. Our panel has received disclosures from the 20 signatories to the Energy Charter, and we've discussed the disclosures with 19 of the CEOs. The purpose of this forum is for the panel to hear from you as consumers and consumer representatives to hear to what extent the disclosures reflect your experience during 2020. We have people from the energy companies at this forum. They won't be speaking, but it's very valuable for them to hear directly from their stakeholders. And the stakeholders in this case cover both South Australia and Western Australia. Just to recap, the Energy Charter was launched in January 2019, and so we're now in its second year. In signing up to the Charter, the signatories have committed to 5 principles. We will put customers at the centre of our business and the energy system. We will improve energy affordability for customers. We will provide energy safely, reliably and sustainably. We'll improve the customer experience, and we'll support customers facing vulnerable circumstances. And each of those principles is to be fulfilled through 24 more detailed principles in action. Signatories represent energy sector businesses across Australia and across the supply chain. So there's generation, transmission, distribution and retail, gas and electricity, and government-owned, privately owned and hybrid ownership. So this year, we asked the signatories to really focus their disclosures to provide a realistic and transparent warts and all response. We didn't want to see a public relations document or hear about actions that signatories have to take in any case through regulation or by law. We asked them to tell us how they went above and beyond the have-to requirements, including implementing the recommendations from last year's report, how they measured any progress since their 2019 disclosures, and how the Better Together initiatives are working. Generally, the CEOs have acknowledged that there's still a way to go in their companies becoming truly customer-centric in their culture, approach, and systems. And you'll find if you haven't seen them already, the disclosures are up on the Independent Accountability Panel website, as well as a record of all the interviews with each of the CEOs. So we want to hear from you about warts and all, but it's also important before we do that to acknowledge the good. 2020 has been an unprecedented year with energy companies and their customers facing natural disasters, fire, flood, hail, drought, and then the COVID pandemic. Companies went above and beyond in keeping the power on, restoring it after infrastructure was burned out or flooded, providing generators where supply couldn't be restored quickly. They moved large numbers of staff to working from home without interruption of service and worked hard to keep their field staff safe and working. Many companies proactively stopped disconnections before they were required to. So, and in our 19 meetings, the CEOs have shown a strong commitment to the Charter and have welcomed this independent review by the panel. They've also acknowledged the importance of the working better together initiatives on the basis that some problems can't be resolved in isolation and need combined action and shared knowledge. So we've completed the CEO interviews. This is the last of the stakeholder wide meetings. We've met with the Energy Ombudsman, and our final report will be published on the 4th of December this year. Before we turn the meeting over to you, it's worth us foreshadowing some of the themes that are emerging from the disclosures and from our discussions with the CEOs. The first is in relation to Principle 1. We'll put customers at the centre of our business and the energy system. We're looking at how this principle is really embedded in each company, from the board and executive level right through to the frontline staff. What customer metrics are in place to measure customer satisfaction and pain points? How far does culture change go beyond the words? So we'll be interested in your experience here, particularly if you're a member of a customer consultative group in any way. In the current COVID environment and economic downturn, we're particularly concerned about principles 2 and 5 that deal with energy affordability and customers in vulnerable circumstances. So Cassandra Goldie will just talk briefly to this. Thanks, Cass.
Thanks, Karen. Again, great to see so many of you on this consult, and welcome to Friday. Look, and as Claire sort of said, we've had a fair bit of engagement with the CEOs of the signatories already, and I just wanted to flag up a few things that I think is going to be particularly important for us to hear your views on. Look, if I can just go for a moment again to Principle 1, which is about sort of the embedding of the voice of the customer in the business of the companies and providers. I just want to get a sense from you of whether you have seen any changes in that area, and whether you think that particularly customers who are more vulnerable or more at risk are having their voices particularly embedded at that level. The second is on affordability. Of course, this has been a pretty extraordinary year. And to what extent you think that the companies, the signatories, sorry, have grappled with the main issues associated with affordability, and whether you think the signatories are prepared for what might be coming in terms of the level of debt, the inability of people to be paying their bills with the coming off, particularly of JobSeeker and JobKeeper and some other arrangements that have been protecting people in the recession and the pandemic. And then thirdly, I think to what extent are you seeing signatories get on the front foot with continuing to drive the transformation of access to energy efficiency measures and distributed energy measures, which of course both are extremely important when it comes to tackling affordability and inequality in terms of the different experiences of consumers and customers in this market environment. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks,
There's
Kat.
others as well, but they're just a few of the areas that we're particularly keen this morning to hear from you about. Thanks.
Another theme that we're looking at is the whole question of energy sustainability, and Andrew Richards will just make a couple of comments about this third energy charter principle.
Yeah, thanks, Claire, and hello everyone. It's great to see so many people on this call. One of the questions we've been posing to particularly CEOs, but also more broadly, is net zero emissions by 2050 as a target, and what that actually means for the energy sector, and how prepared or otherwise the energy sector is for that transition, particularly when you're contemplating investments being made today in energy infrastructure will clearly overlap the 2050 timeframe. So they need to be able to live beyond that and survive, if you like, that transition to net zero. So we're just interested to understand from your perspective whether you think the companies themselves are making headway in this, whether they're thinking about ramifications of net zero by 2050, both at a more broader strategic level, if you can comment on that, but particularly at a granular level, what are they doing on the ground to help communities and to help individuals and small businesses in particular make that transition and make that transition easier without blowing up your bill, without sacrificing reliability. So I'd be really interested to get some feedback from you. I know we've got a few people from WA on this call. We had a good conversation with Horizon Power, about some of the interesting things they're doing over there, and really just like little sandboxes, if you like, on playing around with how you actually integrate renewable energy into a system. And I know in South Australia, that's also becoming a significant issue as well. So I'd be really interested to hear your feedback and comments on that transition issue.
Thanks, Andrew. So now it's over to you to talk about your experiences and where you believe your company's their practices and conduct are consistent with the Energy Charter, or perhaps not so much in alignment. Any best practice examples from other areas, service areas that you deal with, and how you think the energy companies need to prepare for the potential affordability crisis outlined by Cass. So your input is just essential to us in critiquing the 2020 disclosures. And just finally, we're interested in your views just on the role of consumer representatives, because we're aware that the energy sector is very large and the consumer movement is very small and often constrained. If you have any comments just about the just distracted me, sorry, about the consumer sector, we'd be really pleased to hear. So over to you, and who would like to start?
Claire, can I just start with a quick question just on process? Yeah. And that's whether you're planning to look at business by business or sector by sector, so distributors, retailers, whatever, or are we looking at sort of fairly generic comments across the energy charter signatories?
It's a good question, Mark. No, we don't give each company an individual report, but each company will have reflections about them in our report. So the report will be general. I don't mean that to sound vague and non-specific. The report will be very focused on the issues, but each company will not get an individual homework mark, if that's what you were asking.
If I may, Claire, just to add, hello, Mark, great to see you. If there is a particular practice or conduct from a particular signatory that you want to call out, that's fine. I mean, we are, it is in the detail that you often can demonstrate what is a problem, but we will be, as Claire said, it's not like we're going through each signatory and providing a separate report for each of the signatories. Thanks, Claire.
Can I just add to that too, that one of the features, part of the evolution of the Energy Charter is the maturity framework, which is a self-assessment by the energy companies on how they think they're going on the 5 principles. I'd be interested in feedback on how they've ranked themselves, and maybe some ideas and feedback on how we can actually bring, I guess, some more independence to that assessment as a part of the evolution of the framework. It's great to give yourself a gold star, but do you genuinely deserve that? I think it'd be an interesting discussion to have. So if you've got input on that, I think that would be really, really useful.
So would you like to start, Mark, with some general comments at all?
Big mistake, Claire.
I thought I'd get in early, Mark.
I was trying to sort of hang back and, be gracious and all that. And I suppose I've come onto this sort of initially as a South Australian, where there's actually, I think, only one of our companies or one of the network businesses that's actually part of the charter, and that's AGN, or Australian Gas Infrastructure Group. And I have to say, in terms of their commitment to the charter and their engagement practice, I think that they've really done some quite exceptional work. Their real strength has been probably threefold. From a consumer engagement point of view, they have basically not tried to do the spectacular. They've been really solid and consistent in approaching customers, listening to a range of groups, actively looking for culturally, linguistically diverse communities, actively going to regions. So that part of their story has been great. they are driven by a very strong leader, and Ben Wilson, as CEO, is, I think, highly regarded both for his leadership in the business, but his leadership more broadly across the sector. So I'd certainly highlight them as a business that's been very, very strong at linking consumer engagement with CEO and by implication board level. And again, to pick on Ben, you go to an engagement activity, Ben's there front and center. He's talking to individuals. He genuinely wants to engage with people, and he's got time to answer, and he's never defensive, which again I think is very rare. So he's also backed up by a really strong team, and it's a small team, but they genuinely enjoy working with each other, and they see customers as people they want to talk to and not people they have to talk to. And I mean, that sounds a bit glib, but it's to quote the Castle, it's the vibe. And you get the vibe with them that I don't necessarily get with other businesses. So that's sort of a bouquet. I mean, going to Andrew's question, I mean, one of the really big issues that the gas sector is confronting is just the whole future of gas, rules not fit for purpose, personal view, and great uncertainty in a policy environment, stranded assets environment, future of hydrogen environment. So I think we've probably in Australia under-recognised the importance of gas and the speed at which the gas transition is happening or not. I also perhaps highlight gas as an area where I think the next step forward for them, and by implication electricity, is to get better at bringing customers along with the journey, particularly around technologies. It's always, there's still not much experience of any business talking to customers about, here's what the current research is showing, how does this apply? How do we work together on understanding the new technologies? I mean, let's take, again, gas, the implications of ammonia being able to be, or hydrogen being able to be transported as ammonia. What does that mean? Where's the discussion with consumers about how that happens? So to make the point about it's what's the engagement and what's the continuous engagement, rather than, businesses going off, talking, doing their own bits of research, and then coming back and saying, this is what we've decided. So perhaps putting it another way, I've been saying in other forums, in an era of particularly high uncertainty, it's crucial that the key response is to embrace uncertainty. And embracing uncertainty means working with consumer groups, with other stakeholders, rather than, always coming back with, well, here's the answer, please agree with this. So I really want to see the businesses getting stronger over the next 12 months at what I'll call embracing uncertainty. And that means no finger pointing when things go wrong, make mistakes, and work with customers and consumer interests the whole way through. So that's pretty general. That's probably more than enough from me for now. So I'm happy to hold my peace and pick up other issues later. I will come back to the vulnerable customers issue because I could go probably for about 20 hours on that, but I'll hold that.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm sorry, I forgot to say, because you're familiar to some of us, could you just, for those who might not be familiar with you, just say who you are, and whoever speaks, can you just tell us who you are and who you're representing or your interests? So
Apologies, Claire. Mark Henley, and I'm on this call as as Manager of Advocacy with Uniting Communities, so a large community service organisation based in South Australia. But I'm also part of the Australian Energy Regulators Consumer Challenge Panel.
Thanks, Mark.
Mark, a quick question just following up. You talked about the vibe of AGN. Do you get the same vibe from retailers working in SA who are AGL's a signatory, for example? And do you get the same vibe from the network operators who are not signatories? Is it a bit hit and miss, or are we seeing a general movement?
I think the answer to your question, and no, I don't get the same vibe from many other businesses. That said, as someone who's based in South Australia, we just don't have the same connection at all levels of the business with an AGL, an Origin, a Red, a Lumo, whoever. So we're only ever seeing small slices of a retailer, whereas here we get to see a whole lot more of AGN, a fair bit of SAPN, and a bit of Electronet. I mean, just to put it fairly basically, recognising that I don't think either Electronet or SAPN are part of the charter. The issue I find with the retailers is that you can find the best and the worst, I think, in all retailers at most points of time. So, well, sorry.
Attention, the emergency warning systems are about to be tested.
We'll hold that thought, Mark. We'll come
Yeah,
back.
I just might wait for the test to happen. So yeah, I'll come back to you later, Andrew, after the tests.
All right. Who else would like to say something on that point or any other point?
Hi, I'm Jill. I'm with COTA Australia, Council on the Ageing Australia. I'm also here, I noticed, with my energy advocate colleague, Sue Avery. We are part of a group across the national energy market to look at, amongst the other things, the Energy Charter and the statements put out for review. So we put in quite a substantive submission last year. I wanted to say thank you so much to the Independent Accountability Panel for taking into consideration a lot of the things that we included in our submission. I know myself and many of the advocates felt very heard through that process. So I just wanted to say I have full faith in this process as well. And it's great to be here today. With the energy advocates, we haven't yet met to discuss the submissions in full, but something that is popping up as a bit of a theme for us is around that sustainability issue. We haven't got a strong message around the transition to renewables from a lot of the statements, and I understand that you know, this might not be the place for all of that, but because sustainability is so undefined in the charter itself, it has given, in essence, some companies a way out, talking about the transition to renewables, and climate change is an issue that weighs on the heart of a lot of our advocates. So we really want to see that strengthened and perhaps put in there in stronger terms to encourage them to talk about those issues. In addition, when issues around corporate social responsibility are mentioned in the reports, we would really like to see mentions of things like climate mitigation as well. And something that has popped up is around First Nations engagement as well. So what's happening there around engagement with First Nations community, particularly with gas, and what's being done to truly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land beyond just kind of putting it as a, I guess, acknowledgement at the start of their document, but actually embedding it as a principle throughout. So something we would like to see moving forward. Something that we mentioned in our submission last year that has come up again this year is around comparable metrics. So similar to what Andrew was saying before, the comparable metrics between each of them, it's difficult to compare and contrast, which makes it difficult for us who are reading multiple submissions across multiple states and territories to really get a picture of who's doing really well and who isn't, because they're measuring it against their own benchmarks. So that's something we would like to see looked at moving forward as well. But I might throw now to Sue if she's able to talk to it, because I know she had more that she wanted to add. Thank you.
Sue, where are you?
My apologies. I've been responding to a chat request. I don't have a great deal to add at this stage because, as Jill says, we're still processing the disclosures. My own personal experience is, being based in South Australia, that I have noticed considerable effort through AGL to speak more to the customers about where the money goes, what it costs to operate, and what in fact the energy market's all about. And also this year we brought into the sustainability agenda personally with the installation of solar panels and solar battery. And AGL has been very proactive in that space, both during the process and following the process. We're particularly impressed, my husband in particular, who's an economist, with the level of data that we can get on the system that we have, and that is making us much more aware of our own energy usage. In relation to the disclosure statements, I've reviewed a number of them now, in particular AGL, AGIN, Origin, PowerShop, Meridian, and a few others from Interstate. And in a way, the biggest problem with that review process is it's quite difficult to evaluate actual performance against promises, that everybody's using a different format. There is still a lot of spin, and I guess that's understandable because they're public documents. But I second Mark's point that in a way, probably Australian Gas is the one that's being most frank and in terms of its own evaluation of its performance. And even there, it's been quite difficult to assess whether it has done all the things it set out to do last year. So as someone who is an observer in a way of this industry, but is trying to provide useful customer feedback on what's going on, I think it's really essential that in the next reporting round, there is some consistency about the way in which each company reports, and that at the very least, they provide a direct line between what they've promised this year and what they've done. I've worked in corporate governance and strategic planning for many years, and I have analysed these things and tried to pull out the information, but it's been hours of work. And I don't think I should have to do that. I think the companies should be doing that because, frankly, they should be using these documents as the basis of their strategic reporting throughout the coming year anyway. So while that may seem a less relevant comment than sustainability and cost and so forth, if we're to assess the performance of these things, and if all of this effort is to be worthwhile, then I think the companies have an obligation to work a bit harder to make this information easier to access.
Well said. Thank you very much, Sue.
I was going to say that's highly relevant, Sue. It's one of the things that we face as well as trying to make these assessments, is to have that balance. I'm just a question. I mean, are the companies brave enough, do you think, to give themselves a bit of a harsher reality check? And if they did, would you applaud that or would you scold them?
Well, I can only speak as me here. I don't have the authorization of any level of quota for this, but having spent the last 6 years of my life in the public sector, I know how difficult it is to be honest and not cope with the consequences. But Mark singled out Ben Wilson for praise, and I'd have to second Mark's praise. Ben is a great exemplar of being authentic and of not over-promising, but going to the consumers and saying, I recognise we're not doing everything well. Help us solve these problems. I suspect many people would respond quite comfortably to that. We don't want to be told that everything's okay when we as consumers can necessarily see that everything isn't okay. And while I am very impressed with AGL as a customer, I did read some of that report and think, oh, wow, I wonder if that really is the case. And perhaps it really is the case, but they're also omitting the things where there are problems. It's a bit hard to work out because, again, it's not easy to compare this year's report with last year's report, in particular with AGL, I'm finding. So I, as an individual, welcome honesty and authenticity, as long as there is a sense that we're to be involved in the problem solving, that we are being respected for our experience of the products and the services that are being delivered, and that our opinions on those products and services will be taken into account and considered seriously.
Can I make a comment just on that?
Yes, Alex.
Hi, it's Alex Bishop from Energy Consumers Australia. I completely agree with what Sue and Jill were saying. What I also found in terms of a company's ability to be honest in their self-assessment is there were a few standouts that, you know, went so far as to say, we're never going to actually rate ourselves as 5 because we believe that there's still more work to be done. And where I found real frankness is in the CEO statement, the CEO meeting. So I've listened to a few of the CEO meetings, and I really did get a sense from the leadership around that. So I think there was a bit more humility and kind of really honesty, because it's not, you know, in print, it's, you know, in a different kind of fora. And I did get from the leadership more around, you know, some real frankness around that, about their self-assessment, which I found was a great supplement to their disclosure. So, you know, the disclosure now was 10 pages rather than an outrageous amount. So we, you know, saw a real limit adhered to, I must say. But it did mean that there was oftentimes limited information in those. So the CEO meetings were an opportunity to, I think, get some more sort of meat on the bones. And I did appreciate the CEOs and their frankness and particularly in their statements around it. So for me, it did provide the opportunity for them to say, you know, there is more work to be done, because that's what you want to hear. And so I think that in terms of process, the combination of the two disclosures and also the actual in-person meetings was good on that front.
Thanks, Alex. And I think Cass and Andrew might have a comment on this because they were on the panel last year. But it's been a real learning experience for the panel as well. The first year was setting the grounding for it. And so it was a bit, let's put everything in. And then on the basis of us, the panel realising that there was just too much information, it wasn't focused, that's when the second year is much more focused. But we take the point about there's still work to do on those disclosures so that we can try and really understand the progress, the work against the previous recommendations, and a real picture so that we can track that any improvements.
Yes, if I may, I, for example, expected, given that you had outlined underneath each of the 5 principles some expectations, there were a series of expectations, I would have expected the reports to have been organised to respond to that more specific level of detail under the principles. And in fact, that's what I've tried to do in reviewing those documents, is to align what I'm being told to those more detailed points. It hasn't been easy, but that's only because I didn't write the report in the first place. And I feel that there was an opportunity missed by all of the organisations, certainly the ones that I've reviewed, by not taking that approach. I understand they don't necessarily want to be completely templated, but it would make it much easier to assess performance and progress, particularly given that the IAP has indicated what your priorities as a panel are. Frankly, I'd have thought it was logical for a company to therefore think, right, we'll give them what they're looking for. And in a way they have, but you've got a lot of work to do to find it most of the time.
Andrew or Cass, did you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I do. Look, one of the obvious challenges in this process is comparing like for like, and actually tracking not only good initiatives, but what is it really delivering the changes in the end for customers in the areas that matter to customers? And affordability is always going to be at the heart of it, keeping the lights on, etc., etc. I am interested in any of your views at this point about to what extent it is worth, through this process, us trying to also encourage uniformity associated with tracking change and the metrics that should be used, and to what extent you're seeing in your own work the ability to really track what is substantial change rather than small scale or trials. You'll see in quite a lot of the disclosures is reference to particular sort of trials or small scale initiatives, and I don't dismiss those, but they have to be embedded in the systemic changes that we're looking for, so we're getting to scale in the changes. Some of these issues, for those of you who've been involved in this work for a long time, these are not new issues. And none of us want to lose faith in this particular process as being a leadership opportunity to really drive substantial changes for customers. And if there was ever a year when you could build on some of the really extraordinary impacts that have happened for customers, this is the one that could accelerate rapidly in some really critical areas. So I'd be grateful for your comments on that, the metrics and the priorities in terms of the kind of leadership changes that we should be seeing, those in the charter context, ahead of the pack, because that is the purpose of the charter.
Thanks, Cass. I'm really glad you mentioned that. I know that something we talked about as the energy advocates was those little trial initiatives that popped up. We saw that a lot last year. We're seeing it again this year. What I would like to see, if we go for tangible metrics and tangible comparators for what becomes larger scale or embedded projects, is I guess a delineation or a teasing out between what are COVID measures and what is an ongoing something they intend to stick through for the next few years, because we have seen some incredible work done by the companies and providers through COVID, and that has been absolutely necessary. We know that we're heading towards the cliff with JobSeeker. We know that there's a lot of risk for the consumers going into unaffordable arrears. We know that those risks are there, but the risks and the I guess safety net that the providers are putting there are often temporary. So what do they plan to keep, and how do they intend to embed some of those, but not all of those? And that's fair enough. We don't intend for all of the COVID measures to be permanent and forever, but I would like a really clear picture of what is temporary for COVID and what are they going to embed moving forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Jill. Others on those issues?
Particularly on that whole question, I think that's a really good question, and we have asked the same thing ourselves. What moves into business as usual, the best of the COVID response, and what, as you say, was just an emergency response? So that's a question that we're very interested in as well.
Yeah, 2020 has been a hard year, but I think, Jill, as you're pointing out, 2021 could be even harder for a big cohort of people. And when you think about the genesis of the Energy Charter, was to stop this activity of each one in that value chain sort of doing it's their fault. And this idea to say, okay, well, a transmission company can only do so much, and a distribution and so on. But collectively, what can they do, and how can they, and they're really being put to the test now, and would be put to the test next year, in how do we collectively work together, whether it be to collectively forgive debt, collectively work on more sustainable outcomes. And I think there's probably some more ideas through the Better Together initiatives that are part of this, that hopefully we can sort of coalesce around some of those bigger issues. So we've talked to a couple of, or a number of CEOs about Better Together around net zero by 2050 as an example, and how the whole supply chain needs to work on a just transition. So, and I think next year, I think you're right, next year is going to be really important to really test this. We're not going to do this anymore. We're going to do this. It's all about us working together to get a better outcome. So if you've got some ideas there too, I think we'd be very happy to feed that back.
Andrew, I think that's a really good point. It's Rochelle from the West over here. I work for Energy Policy WA, and I'm the consumer advocate for energy consumers. I think you make a really good point about the Better Together initiatives, and that's something that I have seen missed in the couple of industry disclosures that I have looked at, is that there's not a lot of reference to those. Granted, I've only got 2 participants over here, so I've only read 2. So maybe better in the broader cross-section, but we've got some Better Together initiatives that are providing a great mechanism to leverage the experience of other members of the Charter and to work together to achieve these outcomes, and yet we're not talking to it in the disclosures. And in converse, it's a real benefit to the organisations to be utilising that shared learning and that shared work to streamline their business and make it more efficient. So I think, okay, thanks Sabine. But I think it will be, I think it's important to point out which ones you're working to and to kind of demonstrate that you're actually into this and you're interested in it. Because otherwise you're just kind of going about business as usual and you're not actually using the Charter as the Charter and the work that the Charter is collectively doing as a mechanism to achieve these outcomes. While I've got the mic, I suppose, I'll talk to Horizon Power, who are my, the one Western Australian integrated energy services provider that we have. We're in a pretty unique situation over here, and where we're government, Horizon government owned, and they work very much in the regions. The Southwest Interconnected System is serviced by Western Power and Synergy and covers the majority of the population here. They've got a very small chunk, but what I can say in my experience with Horizon over the last year has been that they have been genuinely working to put the customer at the centre of their operation. They have for a very long time been engaged in the local communities, and they have really taken that to the fore in the work that they have been doing. It's been a challenging year, as we all know, but they've continued to engage with the customer in a number of different ways. And they have been quite forward in making sure that the products and solutions that they're putting forward are genuinely for the customer. So when I look at some of the disclosures about, I think it's the first initiative, they've marked themselves fairly harshly on that point, to be honest. I think they do a pretty good job at making sure that that is part of their business. And I know that that's something that is emerging for them. Their recent strategic plan has really pulled that forward. I know there's a lot of work being done to try and consolidate how that sits in their business, but I think they're doing a pretty good job, certainly relative to some of the other experiences that I hear advocates kind of come across. You know, when we look at the sustainability item, I think that's a really critical piece of this, a really critical principle of the Charter, and Horizon is and has been engaged quite comprehensively with the energy transformation strategy that the Western Australian government has put together, and they keep moving forward in leaps and bounds and doing a number of different things to try and integrate more renewable energy into their very small and very delicate to balance little grids that they've got. So they've got some amazing work that's being done there. I guess the thing that I think we could be looking at doing better, both for Horizon and for everybody else, to be honest, is that we're all on this journey of transition. We're all moving. We've all got every retailer, every distributor, they all have a plan for how they're doing it. Nobody's just throwing bits and pieces around the place, but that's all the consumer sees is a token here and a token there, like, oh, we're doing this thing, we're doing this thing. There's no real conversation being taken to the consumer about how they're actually getting there. And in lieu of any major national kind of plan, what each organisation is doing could be a really constructive way of relieving the customer, letting them know that we are actually doing this and we are actually going there, and everybody's kind of anxious about it needing to happen. But as far as I can see, it pretty well is, right? Well, everybody's getting in. There's no point. No point not, because that's where it's going. So we could be talking in a more cohesive kind of manner to the plans that we have as the energy sector, or as participants of the energy sector, that could relieve some of that kind of anxiousness that the consumer has as a whole. Andrew, as well, earlier you mentioned potentially ways to try and get a bit more robustness into the self-assessment against the maturity model. I thought perhaps you could consider using the customer consultative forums to provide a collective assessment, and that was disclosed as part of the disclosure. That would certainly in the West, we've got an independent version of that, so we could do that. But I think that may be another way to kind of get a bit more robustness in there, and that could be checked off there. That's probably all I had.
Rochelle, before we move off from you, could you just talk a little bit more about Horizon Energy's engaging with customers to put the customer first? We're obviously looking for best practice or good practice models. And if you, or Kerry's just made a comment as well, if you can just give a bit more flesh on that too, about how they're going about it and the impact.
Yeah, okay, so one of the first and longest standing things that they've got, which Kerry's pointed to there as well, is that they're local. They're part of the community. They've got people in the communities, and that just makes it very accessible.
Can I just stop you there, Rochelle? Someone's...
Oh, I've got some background noise. Sorry, bear with me. Sorry, joys of being in an office.
I didn't realise that was you, but thank you.
So being in the local community, they create some presence, and it's somebody to talk to. It gives a point of contact, makes it real, and I think that's really helpful. Not necessarily achievable at scale for other people and other organisations, but I think that is a really, really critical part of what they do. But beyond that, they're present in their towns. They engage in a grants program. That's certainly something that they've done recently on the back of COVID, where they've rolled out some supporting grants for different community organisations, and that's been a really important way to enable discussion and support the communities there. They've also been quite engaged with remote communities and the different users of energy in the different ways that that we will use energy in our remote communities, I suppose. So not everybody has a meter where they get a bill after the fact. We've got pre-payment meter arrangements, or we've got Aboriginal corporations who purchase power on behalf of their membership, and so they've been working. They work just in consultation with communities to make sure that they're supplying the power through in a way that they need, to the point where there's a number of different groups seeking to change the way that they access their power, which has been really positive. So what else is there? I think the trials that are being run with a number of different kind of approaches to grid stability have been a really positive way to engage with people, and I think they've used a fairly comprehensive method of getting feedback around how effective those trials have been. Don't ask me on the detail, but it's all looked pretty reasonable. Another thing that they've done, which I think is pretty cool, and I'm yet to get an update on how successful it's been, but they've created this a whole site about the electric vehicle journey for our regional customers. Obviously, it's a pretty challenging idea for people in Western Australia to jump in an electric vehicle and drive in the regions, and so it's a pretty critical transition to be making, as we want to electrify our transport system, that our regional customers can be confident that they do that. And so creating that whole platform allows people to engage and think differently about EVs and to capture, I guess, it allows Horizon to capture some of the concerns and the challenges that people feeling in trying to overcome that, which I think it's been prudent that they're doing it now because it's something that's coming and we don't want to be caught on the hop at the back end from even just from a customer experience, not even from a technical perspective. Campaigns like that have been really positive ones that I think, yeah, you could look to what they're doing and reflect.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Kerry, did you want to add anything? Wherever you are.
No, I think Rachel's pretty much covered it. I'm Chamber of Commerce in the East Kimberley region in Kununurra, and our local Horizon Power are very communicating. They're very open. They're very approachable. And when during COVID, we were kept up to date all the time as to what was coming through on the government grants and things like that. And our local offices has been really good. I am concerned that the future that, just because they're doing it really well, they don't take the focus of that and they continue to do it. Certainly with the solar and renewable energy and things like that, there's a lot of progress up here in that regard with, and also working together with the hydropower. So there's a lot happening up here and the Horizons have been very good in engaging with all community groups involved and communicating to the local community what's happening with that.
Thanks, Kerry.
Hi, my name is Sonia. I'm from HUGS in WA, so hardship grants, utility grants. So totally agree with Rachel and Kerry with Horizon and Synergy. Look, around COVID, everyone has really done the best they can and put initiatives in place probably quicker than before the government was setting the rules on what to say. So I think all of them were very proactive with that. So well done to them all on that one. And just follow up a bit on Horizon. Look, yeah, they're really doing a lot around with their communities. And I think the hardest thing for them, the most challenging, most of it is remote communities and very disadvantaged communities as well. And that's very tough. And just to put that bit into perspective, the average bill we get here is $17.60, and now between now December and March, it goes from 2,500 to 4,000, 5,000. And like I said, with Horizon, due to the remote community disadvantaged areas as well, really scary to see what could happen with these moratoriums. That's not in their control, and people not engaging with them, and they're doing the best they can. They've got a lot of initiative, different credit processes. So they're really even engaging. So families, if someone wants to also put their centre pay and pay $10. So for people that live in family communities, they've really put in a few extra things like that to try to help people get up with their bills. For us, for what we see here is, the concern is what's going to happen going forward, because it's always a struggle as it is with the bills. So we think it's going to be even scarier for for people with the bills exceeding those how it is. And look, let's be honest, you can't use a fan in those community areas. We can't say to people, use a fan and that will help, because that does not do anything for them. So that's what our concern is, and especially with some of the housings where the air conditioners are very, very old, and they're things that obviously the Horizon don't have control of to help customers in that space, but how can they get support as well to lobby for the government to help with fixing those very old, and I don't know if you guys have seen pictures of them, they're very old air conditionings. But I think Synergy as well, they've been quite proactive as well, and they've got different pilot programs and things like that as well in place to help their customers and doing their best to engage. I think one thing that for us that we see, obviously being we have thorough conversations with our clients, and we often refer clients to other emergency services and counselling and things like that. is the high of domestic violence that's happening. And with that example, I know that Synergy at the moment, they have a start over program for people who are in domestic violence, but it's not a policy, they have said. So similar to what we were talking before, what are the things they're doing now? Is that going to be long term? And something like that would be good to everyone to have something in place for people, the vulnerable people, especially domestic violence, where we've seen a huge increase of clients that we're assisting and referring to other services for them to get assistance with that. Besides that, yeah, I don't really have much more to say.
Sonia, those bills that you were quoting, I presume they were quarterly, were they?
Yeah, every 2 months. Yeah, every 2 months. Yeah, it's probably 2 bills combined. So say the summer bill, like the winter bills, 1760, but in the summer, so say in March, when they hit about 2,500 to 4,000, and sometimes we see them higher, that would be about December to March. So 2 lots of bills combined, because people can't afford to pay their bill, even with, you know, a grant does not, to be honest, the grant does nothing. It's not even a Band-Aid. So there's no, it's impossible, and it's hard for Horizon as well. It's impossible to provide long-term solutions in those community areas and disadvantaged areas with the prices of energy costs that it is.
Is solar the answer to those?
Yeah, solar would definitely be a fantastic thing there. And I know that there are obviously, I think Rachel's mentioned as well, you know, there are things that they are trying to look at, and obviously they need the funding for that. But yeah, solar would be definitely, and it's needed, because, you know, eventually they do get disconnected, and it just goes into another family member's name. The bill's still there, and it just starts again.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's, I think, where we start to battle the issues of capital, and then certainly in some Horizon Power areas, grid stability that all needs to come into balance. Customers, residential customers in the West are all on a regulated, government regulated tariff. So cost becomes a function of use as much as anything here, unfortunately. And so it becomes a question about energy efficiency, particularly in the regions, and how we can optimise air conditioning functioning. Basically, it's where the dollars come from up there, which is certainly not an easy thing to overcome. So, but that's something that Horizon certainly work with government on to try and find some answers to. Just another point I might add on the back of Sonia's comments there around family and domestic violence work. It kind of leads me into another thought about one of the real positives that Horizon kind of bring to the evolution of the customer experience in their approach to evolving regulation, is one that seeks to find a better outcome for the customer. Work in customer code development and the like is one that really pushes towards a good consumer-centric outcome, which isn't, I certainly know from an industry side of things, isn't always what happens when people try and get regs changed. So I think that's a really positive thing. Particularly, we are looking at adding some family and domestic violence provisions to our small use code, which is similar to the NER, and Horizon have been very proactive in trying to make sure that happens, along with a number of other provisions. So I think that's another positive we can add to the list.
Yeah, and I agree with Rachel, definitely Horizon. And look, all the retailers, you know, we have a good relationship with them, because along with HUGS, we also do the ERFAS, which is Emergency Relief and Food Access Service. So we can tap into a triage of lots of services, no matter where anyone lives in WA, and assist that way. So they are working with us as well in, you know, putting the clients through to us as well as a warm transfer, letting us know. So we make sure that we provide full support as much as we can. And sometimes we're able to provide further funds assistance through other agencies that we collaborate with as well, like community care and things like that.
Thank you. Who else would like to say anything? I don't want you to leave today's forum without having said what you came to say.
I mean, I've got a couple more comments to make, but I'm also not wanting to jump in if there's others still waiting to speak.
No, go ahead, Mark. That's fine. We've got time.
Okay, I might just make 3 quick comments. The first one is going back to the comment that Andrew asked me before we did the alarm test here, about the vibe in retailers and other non-AGN network businesses. And I think the point I was trying to make was that I don't see internal consistency in a lot of the energy businesses to the same extent that I see it in AGN. So often the consumer engagement people are great, do great engagement work, but and so everything the businesses say about what the consumer engagement teams do is right, but I don't always see where the engagement teams are actually impacting further up the businesses, which again is why Ben as CEO is so critically important, because we just don't see, with a couple of exceptions, we just don't see CEOs and boards involved from a lot of the other businesses to the same extent. And so again, in the larger retailers, to pick on them, get some really good stuff and some really poor behaviour. So I'll make that as sort of a general comment and come back to that point in a minute. The second point I want to make is sort of more broadly about the role of these disclosures. And again, we're looking at the consistency of measures. If I can, I think part of what's going on is, and if I can invoke former ACOS president Julian Disney, he used to talk about looking through the rear view mirror, driving by looking at the rear view mirror. And I think there's a bit of that going on with the energy chart at the moment. There's a fair bit of looking back, but there's not too much looking forward. And what I'd be looking for is the 5 principles being translated by the energy charter into some really quite specific, pragmatic, forward-looking objectives. So quite tangible stuff. And again, I've sent some stuff a long time ago to Sabine about what the UK water businesses are doing, where they made about 4 or 5 quite tangible specific commitments, like, you know, we'll be reducing by 2025 the number of plastic water bottles in the country by X million. That sort of really quite tangible thing. So for me, that's the next progression for the energy charter. And I actually think the disclosure statements would be easier to write and more forward-looking for the businesses if there was some really quite tangible shared aspirational goals that had greater specificity than the current 5 principles. So I'll leave that as a comment or an observation.
Mark, Cass here, that's this question about the metrics, you know, the specific, you know, reduction in energy bills by X percentage by Y time frame. You know, we've got a couple of examples, I think, where that's been provided, but there's not a uniform commitment to even develop those kinds of high-level metrics, and that's where it would be great. I think there is some appetite for that. I think we could, you know, build some of that into this report, this panel report. But I'd be really grateful for any views you've got about, you know, if you were to pick the top 3 to 5, what would they look like? And you don't have to give that answer now, but if you wanted to drop an email about that, we'd be delighted to receive it. And the second point about the forward view, this is about the tsunami of affordability crisis coming, and what are we seeing with the signatories where actually that is what they're looking at, and, you know, using the power of the data access that they've got to be able to be prepared and to be very clear with all of us about what's going to be offered to deal with that, as an example. So have you got any examples of where signatories are doing that second bit of the forward planning and the forward, you know, offerings that they're going to put in place?
Again, I suppose because because my memory only goes back about a week these days. What federal budget? So I've been talking a bit with the AER about their statements of expectations. And this is a bit of a roundabout way to get to answer your question, Cassandra. But I've been quite disappointed that some of the retailers are basically saying, okay, we've given customers a bit of a break. We now need to start reintroducing disconnections, referral of people who are in debt and not paying to debt collectors. We need to return to those sort of practices. And they're making those comments in the context of the AER statement of expectations. Like I say, I find that very disappointing because that's not consistent for me with an understanding of the tsunami that certainly our financial counsellors and colleagues across the country are expecting as probably JobKeeper's wound back, as job seeker payments are reduced. And certainly we know from our clients that that's where the pain's going to come. And a whole lot of people that have been doing okay with increase in job seeker and JobKeeper haven't been needing help because they've been able to get by. We also think that, in terms of the really practical impacts on vulnerable low-income customers of COVID, the group that's been hurt the hardest is people with no income. And that way too well. In making those sort of comments to retailers, we know they've heard it, but we think, but in my experiences, they've really struggled to actually take on board what that means in terms of practice. But again, it comes back to, some retailers, some of the time do great stuff. Some of the time, the same retailers can be doing very poor stuff in terms of responding to customers. Which perhaps leads me to the third point I wanted to make. So does that make sense, Cassandra?
That's fine. Thanks, Mark.
If I come back to you for your, an hour ago, you said, okay, principle 5, vulnerable customers, what's going on there? And I will flag that my organisation is part of a partnership that has put a funding proposal to ECA on vulnerable customers. So that's disclosure of interest. One of the things that we've said is that a real dilemma in dealing with vulnerable customers is that we actually don't have a shared language about what that means. And so, I've got in my head a whole hierarchy about who's vulnerable, ranging from the 1.2% that actually managed to get onto an energy hardship program through, the 17, 18% that respond to can't afford to financial insecurity surveys, to the 30 odd percent who are renters, to another 10% who are casual and marginally above whichever poverty line we're using this week. So we just don't have an understanding of what vulnerability means. And so too often vulnerability is pulled back to refer to people who actually get onto retailer hardship programs, which is a very, very small percentage of the people who actually need to be on hardship programs. So vulnerability, big concern is we just don't have a shared language. Therefore, we actually, I don't think, have a shared understanding about who's vulnerable, what the factors are, and therefore what can be done about it. That said, in South Australia, both SAPN and AGN are actively looking at developing vulnerable customer strategies. So, and I'm aware of this obviously because I've been actively talking to them about it. But they're certainly not there yet. Quite some way to go. So my sense is that in terms of the 5 themes for the charter, the disclosure statements, this is the hardest one, and it's one where most work is needed. I'm also well aware that there's some real challenges in there. Again, we've had a discussion with SAPN very recently about just the definition of who should be a life support customer, where they're saying, look, SA Health says there's probably about 250 people in South Australia who are genuinely life support customers, where they die if electricity's cut off, whereas they've got 15,000 on their list at the moment, and so and there's not a clear understanding between network businesses and retailers about what being a life support customer means, what the process is to get on the list, what the responsibilities are for retailers and network businesses. So for me, in the next 12 months, that's a really obvious one where the energy charter businesses can be saying, okay, retailers, networks, let's get our heads together and work out what the heck's going on and develop some much more effective protocols and understandings and make this work, rather than still, to quote Andrew, the finger pointing. It's the retailers blaming the networks, and networks blaming the retailers. So again, I could talk a whole lot more about that, but I think that the vulnerable customers one is the most critical one for the next 12 months, and it's the least developed of the 5 goals.
Mark, do you think, because in the structure of the charter, there is this sort of separation of the whole notion of a vulnerable customer as being, and it's principle number 5, right? When actually, if you were to put customers at the heart of the work of the business, it would follow that you would probably put the most vulnerable customers at the heart of that work, because if you get it right for the most vulnerable, you've got it right. So it's interesting for me to hear that that's your observation as well. I think that's a really important one, that there is a feeling of this process of vulnerability being added on to other work. And so there is a risk of expanding the inequities, of leaving more vulnerable people behind further and further. Is that an observation you'd agree with, or are you able to demonstrate examples of where we are putting the most vulnerable customers at the heart of the big work?
I still think it's early days, and there's a lot more needs to be done. Yeah. And I don't want to sound glib here, but I think I could talk to different people and get a very different view about who's a vulnerable customer. And Andrew, I'm sure, could mention some of his members who would tell you, hang on, we're vulnerable customers too, even though they're big commercial and industrial, because, supply chains and job shedding and all that stuff. And then, of course, there's a whole lot of small and medium enterprises that are saying, we can't employ people, we can't operate, we want to run a cafe in regional Victoria and we can't, or we're wanting to run a tourism business in far north Queensland, we can't. So I think when we start talking about commercial, industrial and SMEs as being vulnerable, yes, they are vulnerable, but they're not vulnerable to the same extent that a low-income household who's got no other choices is vulnerable. But again, that's my values. I don't think that would be shared at this stage across the energy supply chain. So for me, that's, again, coming back to the point of we actually just need a common language before we can go any further.
Well, there's the issue of shared language, and I think that's an observation that comes through in the disclosures, the variability of who is focused upon there. Of course, then flows into what indicators do you track? What data is significant in being able to identify who is either now vulnerable or that's where you're heading. And so that kind of predictive work using big data is very patchy, I think. We've had a couple of examples of where companies have been tracking a particular change in the size of the bill, or failure to pay bills and length of time. So I think the connection between shared language and then consistency in tracking, who needs to be actively engaged with earlier is a systemic change we don't have yet.
And we've made a few attempts over the years, and there's been some real goodwill by retailers at 2 or 3 different times over the years, but they've always come back to us and said, actually, our data sets don't give us the capacity for predictive diagnostics that we thought they might. I'm still not convinced by that, but I take that on board as legitimate. My other point, though, would be alongside of the more work needed on understanding who vulnerable customers are in the shared language, there's also some must-dos which we've got to deal with in the next 12 months, irrespective of everything else. And that's to make sure that life support customers are known, are contacted by network businesses, and are supported and assisted in the best possible way. And there's rule, and that's part of the rules. They got to do it, and they got to do it better. So I think life support customers is the starting point. Then I think the next most important group is the group we've already talked about, which is the low-income people facing the cliff as job seeker, job keeper are wound back, or whatever happens to them. So I think there's a whole lot of systemic work which needs to be done about data, about language, about understanding. There's also some really specific short-term stuff around life support customers and low-income and vulnerable households that will be less likely to be able to afford the energy they need in the next 12 months.
I'll just flag in the West, there is our major retailer, Synergy, has been working on a predictive algorithm for hardship customers and essentially preempting when they might start to experience it. So that's a really positive step that they've taken, and it's really been really effective in allowing for proactive conversations with households. They're sharing that and working with Horizon in adopting something similar. So to your point about data not being able to provide this information, I contend that there are solutions out there and that people could aspire to finding some answers.
Rachel, I missed the name of who was doing the predictive algorithm work.
Synergy.
Synergy.
And I don't know if you want to expand on it.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
A little, yeah. I'd love to hear a bit more about it. Yes, please expand.
Hi, I'm Anne. I'm from Synergy. So we're not currently members of the Energy Charter, but it is something that we're looking at. We've been working on how we approach hardships and vulnerable customers for, I want to say 12, 18 months now. It's been something that we've been focusing on quite considerably about how we do go through and identify those customers that might be coming into situations where they're facing hard times and working with them to get ahead of that that slide into a true hardship position. So I'm not close enough to the program to have full details across the metrics and how it's working and what it's doing, but we have changed how we're contacting customers. We're sending preemptive messages saying, if you're having trouble paying your bills, give us a call, we're here to help. Changing that discussion. So, that the first time we're contacting them, it's not around, being in a debt collection position, for instance. It's more around what can we do? Can we, put in a payment arrangement? Can we put in a bill delay? Can we, whatever the case is, whatever's going to work for that actual customer, have a chat to them, but then also pairing that with energy use, education, and making sure it's a holistic solve rather than just a financial conversation. So I'm not sure if that helps, and I apologise a little bit on the spot. I don't have the details of the program.
It's Sonia. I've got a little bit of information, and sorry, I'm just going to read on the side because we have monthly meetings with them. So one of them was Synergy. They've identified clients who have been 6 months period or longer in hardship. They had about 800 clients and they each get given a case manager that will assist the clients. And like Kerry said, they engage in the conversations on how to help them and payments going forward and things like that. They also have another group of the clients that they've not been able to make contact with but fit into the long-term group. So they continue to find ways of how they can engage. There's another one called the Tracker Change. They might have changed the name, but this is it was at the start, which is a smart meter technology that identifies higher than normal usage compared to the people in the area and provides notifications to the clients on the usage and what they should be paying to afford their bill.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And then the Project Engage, and that one really similar to what Kerry was saying, they look at the likelihood of the client falling into hardship. And they're making proactive calls and have their conversations with them. And I know that in August, they were doing about 100 outbound calls a day.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Sonia. Yeah, I know there's some of the things that you've mentioned there are quite new initiatives that we've put in place there, especially around the case managers and those sorts of things. We're running through a program at the moment called Project Connect, which has a range of different options and even to the point that, look, we're looking at whether or not we can put systems in place where we can do things like payment matching and those sorts of things. So providing incentive for customers to make small payments, and then we can almost reward that behaviour by providing a matched payment for those for those bills. So I think some of that we're still sort of working through the feasibility. But yeah, I know that the team downstairs in our customer experience team are really focused on this. We've run co-creation workshops with our customer base to understand what the issues are, what solutions we can put in place that will actually help with this.
Nan, could I just clarify? Thank you for that. Are you talking this, about this in terms of a business as usual approach or just a COVID approach?
Oh, look, a lot of this work, Projects Connect would have started, I want to say, before COVID. So, you know, certainly the government has come in place and put in moratoriums, and we've provided small business credits and in residential customer credits as part of the COVID response. But no, this Projects Connect and the work that went in before that were part of our BAU.
So you're looking long term,
yep.
Not short term. That's
yep.
Right.
So similarly with, I think it's been mentioned a couple of times before, the domestic violence programs, partnerships with Food Bank in those situations as well. That work was all pre-COVID.
Yeah, middle of last year that all started.
Now, look, I'm sorry, we're rapidly running out of time. So I want to make sure that everyone who wants to have a say has a say, or if there are any last minute things that you need to get on the record. There is still...
Can I just say something, one thing quickly?
Yes, Alex, go.
It's Alex. I just wanted to go back just to touch on a few of the points. So in last year's declarations, our submission, we did point out that there were a lot of initiatives that were proposed, and what we were, the ECA in our submission, we were very much focused on, that's great, but how are you then embedding this into practice, which we're seeing a bit of, and where is the evidence of translation? And we've touched on that a bit, and I have seen it coming through in some of the submissions this year, which has been great, because there's been a real commitment I see to putting the customer first and using the data they have about the customer, you know, really kind of tailoring solutions to doing better for customers. And I think COVID really is the window into, you know, this corporate culture about what values are and what their priorities are and how they really are putting the customer first. And I see, particularly around, we're seeing real ambition here and innovation, that we see that COVID's not, you know, yes, there is an emphasis on dealing with vulnerable customers that's coming out of, you know, the COVID pandemic, but we're also seeing some companies really using this as an opportunity to drive innovation and to be proactive and to really use an opportunity to boost their engagement and boost their commitment to the customers. And this, the Synergy example, and also Horizon, what they're doing is a real examples of that, which are to be commended. As I was reading the declarations, and I was really excited about some of the initiatives that I read about, you know, in these terrible times, we do see some really inspired programs and some inspired work that are being customer driven. So I just wanted to call out that, you know, in year one, it was all about sort of initiatives, but year two, I do see in some of these declarations, I do see that, you know, this is what we plan to do, and this is what our outcomes, proposed outcomes are. So some of them have actually done that translation work, but I do agree that it does need to be standardized a little bit more. And so, you know, it's a good opportunity now. Yes, they're sort of coming along in the journey in year two, but, you know, what do we see? How can we boost this into year three is really what we're looking for. You know, how they, as we've all said, embedding it into BAU, how are they, you know, year two, you know, getting to know the customers a bit more, some of these pilot programs in year two, how are they going to be, you know, boosted and really driven in year three? And we want to see more of the story about initiative, customer focus, why we're doing what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what the outcome, proposed outcome will be. So let's look forward to year three.
Thank you, Alex. Look, we have run out of time, but thank you for all the information in the chat room. That's been very helpful. And we could have discussed the whole question of, are there better practice models, good practice models in other areas? And some of you have raised water and telecommunications that we might have a bit of a look at. But thank you very much for your time. We could continue this discussion, but we have run out of time. If you would like to make any sort of submission, we would really welcome it. We're not looking for war and peace. Some dot points, some stories, some case examples would be very telling for us. And the information is on our website, but it's basically submissions at the energycharterpanel.com.au. Anything would be really helpful in our critique of the disclosures this year. And there have been some great suggestions that have come out of today's discussion. We really appreciate that, and we'll definitely take them on board. So thanks everyone for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you.